Hello and welcome to Solomoriah Speaks, Episode 10, Let's Build a Dungeon. At the end of the last session on my online game that I'm currently running, the player characters were returning to the Druid's cabin in the woods, where they've been staying in between forays into the Dungeon of Kairos, which is out of our Adventure Anthology 2. And I've been rolling for basically one possible wilderness random encounter each time they traverse the distance between the dungeon and the cabin. And this time around, I rolled an encounter, and the encounter came up as owlbears. I rolled for the number of owlbears and came up with 2. The player characters, for their part, were all somewhat injured and out of spells, but all still basically functional, able to attack and move and so forth normally. And well, all except for the druid, actually. He'd gotten kind of beaten up at the end of the last one, and they were all kind of guarding him. So they saw the owlbears on the map. The owlbears saw them. No one was surprised, and the owlbears moved to attack. And the players did the best they could. I really feel like at this point they did the best they could under the circumstances with the available options. But the dice didn't like them. They missed a surprising number of attacks, while the owlbears hit a surprising number of attacks, and owlbears are pretty fierce opponents. They did injure both owlbears, but they weren't able to incapacitate either one of them. And the owlbears basically disassembled their magic user, the injured druid, and an NPC fighter who was a retainer to the magic user, leaving the fighter and the thief of the party to escape. The fighter by returning in the direction of the dungeon for a while, before finally risking crossing back to the cabin. And the thief climbed a tree, and being a halfling was able to hide in the natural surroundings well enough that the owlbears didn't notice him. He was then obliged to stay up there in the tree while the owlbears devoured his comrades. If I ever heard of an argument for PTSD at a player character, I think that's probably it. Obviously, the owlbears weren't defeated. So, now I'm faced with a situation where the two new player characters are being brought in. They've already been generated. They'll be joining us for the next session. And I need to decide how they're going to proceed. There's every reason to think that they're going to want to find and defeat the owlbears. Probably from a position of strength, we would hope anyway. So they've got a lair somewhere. Presumably they're owlbears. They have lairs. Not really sure what the biology of an owlbear is like from that perspective. I've never thought about it before, but I'm going to now. But I thought, as I was thinking about this, I thought this would be a good place to throw in a small side quest dungeon, 10, 15 rooms, something like that. Where the owlbear's lair would be the outer room, the first room that you encounter as you enter this buried underground warren. And I thought this would be a good example. People have been asking me off and on to do a video about creating adventures, and this seems like a very good time to do this. So I went and dug through Dyson Logos, DysonLogos.com, links in the description. Dug through his catalog of commercially available maps, ones that I could use for free commercially for this video and potentially in print. And I found the Lost Catacombs of Adrih. And I thought, this is what I need right here. It's a small dungeon. I'll show you the map in a little bit. It's a small dungeon. It has an outer room that would be adequately suitable for an owlbear lair. And so I'm going to go forward with building an adventure there. I'm going to show you guys the map. I'm going to discuss how I decided what to put in the dungeon, both in terms of what kind of monsters and what distribution of room contents. We're going to talk about both. I'm going to talk a little bit about random dungeon stocking. I'm going to talk a little bit about not random dungeon stocking. I'm probably going to do a little bit of both. Spoiler alert, as it were, I haven't actually done the dungeon design yet. I've looked the map over, numbered the rooms and so forth, which I'm going to go over in a minute. But I haven't actually stocked it yet. So you're going to get to see that more or less in real time with me. It is 3 days until my game. Today, tomorrow, and then all day Wednesday, and then Wednesday evening is game time. So I've got 3 days to get this adventure written, while also getting some actual work done in the real world, and trying to have a little bit of a life maybe. We're going to see if we can get a dungeon done in 3 days, to a point that I can use it. I don't expect it to be a problem, actually, despite all that build-up. I'm not, at least initially, I'm not building a dungeon adventure for redistribution. I'm building a dungeon adventure for my use. So there's a lot of frills and frippery that I won't have to worry about first pass through. So that's enough talk. Let's get on with the subject. Let's look at the map. So let's start by looking at the map. Here you see the version that Dyson Logos provides on his webpage. This is the original version of the map, the Royal Catacombs of Adrih. I really like this map. It's nice and compact. It should make a good place to have a starting lair. You can see the entry room that is right at the bottom of the stairs on the left-hand side. That should work just fine for a owlbear lair. Maybe even use that room and the next room to the south together as the owlbear lair. So that's where I'm starting. This is the dungeon I'm starting with. But as you can see, of course, Dyson didn't number the rooms. So the first thing I have to do is put numbers on the rooms. Now, numbering rooms is an art, not a science. In general, you'd like to number rooms the players are going to encounter more or less in the order they're going to encounter them, but unless the dungeon only has one way through it, which sounds kind of boring, it's not really possible to do that all the time. So for example, if you'll notice, room 1 branches off to rooms 2 and 3. 3 won't be right next to 1, even though that's fairly likely that the players will try to go that way as soon as they find the door. Well, maybe 25%. It kind of depends on your players, I suppose. I have numbered area 3, even though it's just a corridor, because I'm going to put an inscription there. I'll talk about that in a little bit. I've also numbered area 8 to the right of area 2, because the narrow neck separating it from area 7, plus the fact that there's obviously water there, and it's up a staircase, I thought that might be a good place to drop a trap or a special of some kind. Probably not a monster encounter there, but who knows. Now, I also numbered things so that the last numbered room, room 12 in the upper right, is the secret room that is probably where the big bad, if there is a big bad to this adventure, probably where the head bad guy hangs out. It's obviously the actual heart of the Royal Catacomb. It's got room for 5 sarcophagi, which I've lettered A through E. I don't know how I'm going to use those yet. We'll get to that. But that's what I did. That's how I did it, so I'd be able to use this area effectively, I hope. So, now you've seen the map. So let's talk a little bit about how I'm creating this adventure. So, the first thing a game master thinks about when stocking a catacomb is undead monsters. I mean, it's just obvious. You have a facility full of dead people. And what do you make undead monsters out of? Dead people. So it's very convenient. It's very obvious. It's practically a cliche. For that reason, I decided I was not going to do that with this dungeon. I was going to fill the catacomb with something else. But I hadn't decided what yet. Then I looked at the map and I thought, but these are royal catacombs. So there should be an inscription. Remember I mentioned that. There should be an inscription somewhere in these catacombs. And then I thought of Shelley's poem Ozymandias. I'm not going to read it to you. You can find it online. I'm no poet. But the irony of that poem really struck me as perfect for this purpose. Adrih is not a kingdom in my campaign world that anyone's ever heard of. And rather than try to make it part of the history, I decided that it is just a forgotten kingdom. No one remembers Adrih. No one's ever heard of it. So the inscription I came up with was, "Here lie the mortal remains of the first kings of Adrih, founders of an undying kingdom." An undying kingdom that no one's ever heard of. I thought that'd be good for a laugh. The players go in, find someone who has the spell or the knowledge to read this inscription, because if it's a forgotten kingdom, it's probably a more or less forgotten language. I have ideas about how I want to proceed with that in the adventure, but it's not too critical at this point for me to make a decision. But it struck me as funny and appropriate, and it definitely has to go in there. Into room 3, if you were paying attention to the map. But then I thought, an undying kingdom. Well, crap, now I'm stuck. I have to do undead monsters. It just seems like too many clues in the right direction. There's got to be some undead in here. Now, there's a terrible temptation as a developer of a dungeon for basic fantasy RPG, especially for me, if you are trying to fill a dungeon with undead and you want a big bad, but you're not dealing with really high level characters, there's this terrible temptation to use a Zombrair or Skeletor from Field Guide 1. The Zombrair is a monster created by the author of the Adventure Anthology 1 adventure, The Zombrair's Estate. He invented it as a kind of a one-off monster, but as is common with us in the Basic Fantasy Project, we just can't leave well enough alone. One-off monsters always end up with stats in a field guide. It's just how it goes. And in fact, the Zombrair and the Skeletor grew out of that encounter. I filled in some of the blanks, but not my original monster. I cannot remember the author's name. I'll put it on the screen. But it's a good adventure. It's one I've run before. Many people have talked about how much fun they had running it. It's kind of gross, as good undead adventures can be. And I have a bad habit of using spellcasters as big bads. I'm terrible. I mean, there's a reason why I have a module set, an adventure set called Strongholds of Sorcery, because I just keep building dungeons and towers and castles full of evil wizards and having player characters break into them. It's a fixation. In fact, as I say that, I'm sitting here thinking about a possible adventure I want to write in the future with exactly that basis. So I need to stay away from that. I haven't decided what I'm going to put in this dungeon for a big bad yet. It's going to have to be something kind of horrible. And it's going to have to be something tough for the player characters, but I don't want to make it too tough. I'll make this an adventure that they can survive and profit from. But I definitely want a challenge for them. So we'll go back to that. So now we're going to talk about basics of dungeon stocking. Let's start with randomly stocking a dungeon. This is the table from the Basic Fantasy RPG core rules for randomly stocking dungeon rooms. Looking down the table, you can see that there are various chances of different types of contents appearing in a room. I'm going to go down what the types are. Empty is, well, empty. That doesn't mean the room is completely vacant, devoid of contents, etc. A storeroom that is absolutely full of useless items is empty in this terms. Empty just means it doesn't have any of the things listed below empty on the table. Unguarded treasure is unguarded treasure. There's treasure in the room without any monster guarding it or trap guarding it, protecting the treasure. Unguarded treasure is still normally hidden. The room should be built like an empty room, which means that it might not really be empty. It might be full of otherwise useless or low-value items, and the treasure is hidden in or under something or behind a secret door and a hatch in the floor. Hidden however hiding it works for you as the game master, as the author of the dungeon. A monster encounter is a monster encounter. It means that a room that has a monster or a group of monsters in it. This could be a wandering group that has just stopped for a while in this room. A very common one, for instance, is a camping group of humanoids, hobgoblins or orcs or whatever. Or it could be a monster lair with a monster that just doesn't have treasure. Normally, you should not choose monsters that normally have treasure in their lair to put into a room like this unless they're just wandering around, and this isn't really their lair. The next section, monster with treasure, basically means this is either the monster's own lair where it keeps its treasure and the monster is there, or the monster encountered is carrying significant treasure for whatever reason. It could be as simple as a group of hobgoblins who are transporting their tribe's treasure from one place to another and have stopped to camp out, if that makes sense in your dungeon design. Specials are tricky. In fact, specials are sometimes called tricks. A special is anything in a room that can cause the player characters trouble, but it's not specifically a trap. Can waste their time, generally not going to directly harm the characters in terms of causing hit points of damage, because that's usually either a monster or a trap. But a special is interesting. Not really sure how to describe them, but we'll be doing one special for this dungeon. More on that later, so we'll come back and discuss that. Trap and trap with treasure are, I think, pretty basic. A trap is just a trap. There's a whole page of them in the basic fantasy core rules as examples for you to use as a game master designing your own dungeon. It's basically an inanimate object, not a monster, nothing that has hit dice or an attack routine, just something that hurts player characters. Spears thrusting out of the walls, darts from the ceiling, poison gas, anything that is a trap, basically. And trap with treasure is the same thing, except that there's a treasure hidden behind or within the trap or the trapped area. The treasure in this case is basically the same as an unguarded treasure, except that it's guarded by the trap. So that's all there is to it. You can go through a dungeon map room by room and roll the dice for each room and write down the general contents and then come back and fill in the details later. That's how this chart is designed to be used, how it's intended to be used. But there's more that you can do with this table than is obvious. Let's take a look at the actual percentage distribution. As you can see, there's a 16% chance a room is empty, a 4% chance it has unguarded treasure, 40% chance of a monster, or 24% chance of a monster with treasure, meaning that rooms are 64% likely to have a monster in them, and so forth, going down the table. Now, these percentages are interesting because we can apply them to the number of rooms in the dungeon. We know our dungeon has 12 rooms. If we apply those percentages to 12, rounding to one decimal place for my convenience, we see this distribution: 1.9 empty rooms, half of an unguarded treasure, half of a special, half of a trap with treasure, one trap, 2.9 monsters with treasure, and 4.8 monsters without treasure. That's not that useful. We need to round that up to the ones place. But now we take a look at this. We have 2 empty rooms, 5 monsters, 3 monsters with treasure. We've rounded everything that was 50% up to 1. So we have 1 unguarded treasure, 1 special, 1 trap, and 1 trap with treasure. This is pretty decent, except for one problem. You add all those numbers up and you come up with 14. That's obviously not going to work. We will use these numbers. I've reduced the number of empty rooms by 1. I've reduced the number of rooms with regular monster encounters by 1. We now have 7 monster encounters and 1 of everything else. We have a grand total of 5 treasure hoards, 3 that are protected by monsters, 1 protected by a trap, and 1 that's hidden somewhere. So this is how we can do this. Now, this is not exactly random stocking, but this is using the random stocking table to figure out our room distribution. And this is a trick I've used on many occasions with smaller dungeons. I think it works a little better with smaller dungeons, where the random rolling system works a little better with larger dungeons, where the averages come out a little better. But this can become a pattern. You can fall into a pattern here, and I've talked in other videos about the importance of the game master steering clear of having too much of a pattern. So you might want not to do this. Stocking a dungeon non-randomly, stocking a dungeon based on what you think needs to go in there, is absolutely fine. A great many very interesting dungeons were stocked in exactly that way, were designed and built exactly that way. It's just that for a general, we tripped over this in the wilderness, the random stocking or the using the distribution of the random stocking table to stock a dungeon is easier, quicker. It works pretty well. So you do it however you want to. For this video, I am going to use the distribution that you see in front of you. So I'm going to lay these rooms out to match this distribution. So, moving on. Okay, so room 1 is our entry. In this room, and room 2 below on the map, we're going to place the owlbears. The owlbears aren't interested in the doors. They're not interested in going through them or exploring the rest of the dungeon. They are owlbears. They are mainly interested in killing things and eating them. That's pretty much what they do. And in reproducing. We'll get to that in room 2. For room 1, I'm going to go ahead and add the statistics for the owlbears. There are 2 of them. I type up the statistics. I'm using the adventure template pulled off of the Basic Fantasy RPG forum. Even though I'm not initially planning on publishing this, I'm just going to use this adventure for myself. I do like to have my checkboxes and so forth that I'm accustomed to having in my own adventures. So I go in and I type up the statistics, and I go to the checkboxer page on the tools for the Basic Fantasy website. I'll put links for everything here in the description. And I generate checkboxes for these owlbears, resulting in the statistics that are shown on the screen with the checkboxes and so forth, 22 and 25 hit points. This is not actually the same numbers I used with the random encounter, but it's not critical. The random encounter monsters didn't die, so the players don't really know how many hit points they had anyway. Now, owlbears have treasure, not surprisingly. They have treasure type C, to be exact. Still on the Basic Fantasy RPG Tools page, I choose the treasure generator and put in treasure type C. I could just roll dice on the table provided in the core rulebook. That works just fine, but this is just a little bit quicker. And this is the results I got for a treasure type C. 2,300 copper pieces, 700 silver pieces, and a nice magic user scroll. This is a pretty decent treasure for a third level group, which is what I'm aiming this at. Not a huge amount of money, but some. But more importantly, the magic user scroll will help them out quite a bit. Now, one of the things that I like to do, I like to change the number of coins in most treasures so they aren't just even figures. Especially in this case when the treasure has presumably been gathered by the owlbears who must like shiny things. The number of coins in the treasure is not going to be some even figure. What I do in this case, since I have 2 zeros here, I deduct 100 and then roll percentiles to see how many coins are there, resulting in these numbers: 2,247 copper pieces, 673 silver pieces. It's a very similar value treasure. We're not changing the magic item, obviously, but it's a very similar value of treasure, and that's what we're going to assign as the treasure for these monsters. Now, I've rolled this treasure, but actually I'm going to put it in room 2 because that's where all the valuable stuff is. For room 1, I'm just noting the statistics of the monsters. If they're not in this room when the room is entered, they will enter from room 2 more or less immediately and start tearing apart the party, because that's what they do. They're owlbears. In room 2, we have an owlbear nest. Now, I said I don't know about the ecology of owlbears. I have never really thought about it, but it seems logical to me that number 1, they live underground because they're bears, and number 2, that they live in a nest because they're birds. So I'm going to describe a nest in here. I'm not going to actually write it down right now, but I'm going to describe a nest in this room. And in the nest are, let's say, 2 or 3 eggs. This is what they're taking care of. I'm going to say that they just laid the eggs, which is why one owlbear is always here, and the other owlbear may or may not be here, and I'll put some die rolls in for that. I'll put the die rolls in room 1 because that's where it's relevant. I'm probably going to give a 25% chance that both owlbears are present, and the remaining 75% of the time, one owlbear will be present. It's not really important that the players know which one is male and which one is female. They're killer monsters that take turns sitting on their eggs. So the treasure is in the nest. It is actually kind of just scattered all over inside the nest, so it'll be necessary to kill the owlbears and tear their nest apart to get all those copper and silver pieces out. And there's enough copper pieces there to ensure that the players are going to spend significant time. I may make a note about this, or I may just make it up as I go along. So that takes care of rooms 1 and 2. I'm creating this dungeon for my own use to start with. So I'm not going to make notes about all the stuff that would go into boxed text in one of our regular adventures. I'm going to make this up as I go along. When I run this adventure, I'll be fresh off of having written down all these statistics and all this information. And so I'll have a pretty good idea what should be here already. So therefore, it's not really important that I write it down in advance. And in fact, what I'll probably do is make notes about what I come up with on the fly, how I describe the dungeon to the player characters, notes about what I got right, and maybe notes about things that I'm not happy with that I did. And that will inform me as I go back and revise this adventure for possible publication. Adding in the box text to include the descriptions, either the ones I used with the players or the ones I should have used if I decide I've made mistakes. Mistakes aren't usually critical in situations like this. Don't sweat it. But when you go to write it down, obviously you want to make it as good as you can, and that's what I'm going to do. In room 3, which is really just a corridor, I'm going to describe the presence of the inscription I previously mentioned. Here lie the mortal remains of the first kings of Adrih, who built an undying empire. Or kingdom, I don't know. I'm still working on it. But I will, I'll just put that down here in the adventure, and I'll read it to the players when they get there, so that if they are able to read it. This leads me to an interesting decision. The scroll of magic user spells in the treasure for the owlbears has clairvoyance, continual darkness, ice storm, and protection from normal missiles. I will probably drop one of those. I'll probably roll randomly because those are all pretty nice spells to have handy. So I'll roll randomly, drop one of those, and replace it with read languages. There's probably a scholar in some dusty room somewhere in the world who still knows how to read the language of Adrih. So I'm going to assume that that's going to work for them. I am the game master. I can make that decision for myself after all. So I'll add that on the scroll, and then when they're confronted with the inscription, they'll immediately have the option, if there's a magic user in the party, which there will be, they'll immediately have the option to read the scroll and therefore translate the language. I'll offer other options for translation as well, so they may not have to use the scroll. Little things like this are nice touches to put into a dungeon adventure. You should give some options like this to the players, but maybe don't give everything away, especially if you've got a really good treasure somewhere and a potion of treasure finding. Best place to hide a potion of treasure finding is in a well-hidden treasure. So that takes care of room 3. Okay, so I am looking at the map, literally. Looking at the map and considering what to do with the rest of this. I mean, I knew starting out what was in the first 3 rooms because I had to have the owlbear lair, and I already knew I wanted an inscription. Now, I have a number of monsters and treasures to place, but the specific thing I want to look at right now are the things that we only have basically one of each. We've got one trap with treasure, one unguarded treasure, one special. Looking at this dungeon, this is a catacomb. This is not only just any catacomb, it's a catacomb where the great kings of an ancient land were buried. If that doesn't scream out to you for traps, I don't know what movies you've been watching. But I'm seeing this, I'm thinking that we need traps in here. This needs to be a place that has traps. But at the same time, it's very ancient. So maybe some of the traps have malfunctioned. Maybe some of the traps are not working like they should. Maybe they've crumbled away. That would explain a relative lack of traps in what might otherwise be a trap-ridden dungeon. And what I'm going to do is in room 8, which is the corridor space here next to room 2, I'm going to place a trap that has been partly exposed. There's obviously a rock fall, a collapsed wall there anyway. So I'm going to have a trap that's partially exposed, visible to players who open the door, and causing them to pause, to think about it, to try to decide what to do about it. I'm leaning towards a dart trap or a crossbow trap. Maybe they open it up and they see an array of little holes exposed by a collapsed section of the ceiling, pointing towards the door that they're just then opening and coming through, and leading them to think that maybe there's a pressure plate in the floor, and there is a pressure plate in the floor. There is a pressure plate, and when they step on it, it will make a clicking noise and kind of a grinding of stone on stone, because this doesn't really work right anymore, but they'll feel it sink under their weight. That would have triggered the dart trap if the dart trap was still working. Oh, okay, so here we go. Simply walking through Area 8 is perfectly harmless. The trap is broken. It won't fire. The darts won't come flying out if you walk across the pressure plate, but you'll feel the pressure plate move and click. The first person stepping on it will anyway. And after you've walked away for a little bit, I may describe a creaking sound or a grinding sound as the plate slowly lifts back into position. Ancient springs fighting against all that corrosion and age and grit and so forth. But if a thief tries to disarm the trap and succeeds, that thief will realize that the trap was broken and wouldn't have done anything to them anyway. And I'm going to double the chances of successfully disarming the trap. So whatever the thief's ability is, I'm going to double that. But if they fail that doubled roll, they accidentally fix the broken trap and it goes off, firing its darts at them. Maybe it don't all fire. Maybe just some of them. I'll have die rolls for how many darts fly out, and then I'll have rolls for each attack rolls for each character in the area. Or no, it's just a cloud of darts. So we'll go with a saving throw to avoid being damaged by the darts. And each character in the affected area, which would be the square where the 8 is, and every square going back, unless the door's closed. Every square going back all the way into room 2's corner. A nice path going back there. And that'll require quite a bit of typing description when I describe it, but I can remember this because this is the adventure I'm going to run in like 2 days now. It's Tuesday. Well, tomorrow. So basically, yeah. So yeah, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put a malfunctioning trap there. Like most specials don't do harm to player characters. I'm going to make an exception on this one. I think this does qualify as a special because it doesn't work the way it appears to. It's not a straight trap that's going to harm you if you don't disarm it or avoid it. It is a trap that's going to harm you if you screw with it. I personally think that's hilarious. So that's the special, and that simplifies matters quite a bit. Now, some of the other rooms in this dungeon may end up being kind of special. I want to call your attention to 2 rooms. I'll show the map on the screen here for a moment. Room 6 and Room 12. Room 6, partially flooded, obviously has a sarcophagus on a dais. But we also have the sarcophagi in the secret room 12. Room 12 has got to be the room where the great kings are actually interred. That's got to be where they actually are. So I'm going to deal with that later. Room 6 I'm going to call the false tomb. It's not a false tomb. It actually is a tomb. There's going to be a guy buried in there in the sarcophagus. Maybe he was a bodyguard of one of these great kings, possibly the first, or illegitimate son, or somebody who would qualify for some honor, but who doesn't qualify to be stuck back in room 12. But we're going to put a trap in there, or we're going to put a trap with treasure in there. I think a trap with treasure in there would be good. Anybody who opens the sarcophagus may trigger the trap. I'm thinking a poison gas trap. There are gates marked in the entrances from 4 and 5 into 6. And there's also a gate marked from the entrance from 9 into 11. Okay, there's not a gate marked between 11 and 6. So I was thinking about a gas trap that would actually trap the characters. Portcullises drop and gas is released. I'll save that for another one. I've actually done it before. I mean, at this point, I've done most of these things before. So I'm just going to go with a basic poison gas trap, or poison gas trap. But again, it's old, it's weak. Instead of outright killing the characters, anybody who fails their saving throw against the poison is left coughing and choking for a number of rounds and suffers a D6 or a D8 or maybe 2D4 points of damage, whatever feels right to me when I type it up. So that's what I'm going to put in 6. And then the treasure is under the sarcophagus. The whole sarcophagus has to be moved, and I'm going to require a lot of strength to do that. There are a number of different ways I've seen this approached in modules. I'm just going to say that moving the sarcophagus, because obviously several characters can push on a sarcophagus, I'm going to say that moving the sarcophagus is going to require 30 or 35 points of total strength added together. So 2 or 3 characters could put their backs into it and slide it out of the way. Of course, if they don't think about moving the sarcophagus, they'll never find the treasure. I will generate an unguarded treasure for this. In fact, I'm going to drop them on the screen here shortly. I'm going to generate 2 unguarded treasures because I have another one to hide somewhere. Okay, so that takes care of room 6. Room 12, where the kings are. Okay, I said we were going to do undead monsters. We're going to do undead monsters. we're not going to do a necromancer or a zombrair or anything like that as a big bad. We're just going to have some undead monsters. There are 5 sarcophagi in that room. The first sarcophagus has a mummified dead body. It's not animated. This is the first king, the oldest. Not animated, just lying there. And then the second one, B has a skeleton. C has a zombie. D has a wight. E has a mummy. They get worse as they go around. Each king animates as a more and more powerful undead monster. The treasure in the room, I'll take a look at the options. I'll probably either use a mummy treasure or an unguarded treasure for the treasure in the room. If you do a treasure in a room that has monsters where it's not their treasure, I talked about this a little bit earlier, but I don't think I clarified this. You do a treasure in a room with a monster that normally doesn't have a treasure, or it's a small group of wandering monsters. If they're not carrying the treasure themselves, then the treasure can be an unguarded treasure. In other words, the monsters are coincidentally in a room that also has a hidden treasure. And there's absolutely no reason not to go ahead and do that for any monster with treasure slot that you're filling, or for any time that you just want to stick that kind of thing into a dungeon. The treasure doesn't have to be the monsters. They might be looking for it. If they're humanoids, they might be searching the dungeon for a treasure, and they might be this close to finding it when the player characters catch up to them. So I don't know which kind of treasure is going to be. I'm going to look at that, and I'll fill this in when I come back to room 12 later and actually detail everything. But this is a planning phase. So that has the special, the trap with treasure, both placed. I still have a trap and an unguarded treasure. Room 7 looks like a good place for an unguarded treasure. And in fact, hiding it doesn't even seem complicated. The unguarded treasure is underneath that fallen rock section in the upper left corner, right in there. That's where the treasure is. I'll roll an unguarded treasure. I will describe the room. Very likely with that alcove in the room in the corner, we're going to end up with player characters searching for secret doors there. In fact, I'm sure that was what Dyson was thinking when he drew it. If he wasn't thinking that, that's what I'm thinking. So that's got the unguarded treasure placed. That leaves us with one regular trap somewhere. The regular trap is in room 11. The regular trap is associated with the secret door into room 12. I need to think on this. When I come back to room 11, I'll have a trap thought up for that. But that's what it is. The one last trap is still successfully, for the moment, guarding the final tomb. So that places that. That leaves rooms 4, 5, 9, and 10 to contain monster encounters, besides room 12. That's not as many monster encounters, quite as many as I was expecting, but again, I've kind of combined 1 and 2 into a room together. Now, room 10 is behind a gate, and it has what appear to be 3 circles and some debris. I'm guessing those are urns, and I'm going to say those are urns. So I'm going to have to place something in there. That's a perfect place for a monster with treasure, where the treasure is in one of the urns, underneath something not particularly valuable. And the other 2 urns might contain the monsters. Maybe we'll have something goopy, rather than having a... yes, quite possibly. Rather than having an undead monster encounter, we'll have some kind of goopy critter, okra jelly, a small black pudding, something like that, in one or both of the jars. So that's got an encounter for that room. Room 9 has another one of those alcoves that they're going to end up searching for secret doors. 9, 5, and 4 are connected without closed doorways blocking them off. So that's going to be a little bit more tricky with a monster encounter. If there's a monsters in any of those rooms, the monster's basically in all of those rooms. So I kind of need to treat those 3 rooms as if they were a lair together. But on the other hand, I say lair, I'm going to say we're looking at undead, placed there as guardians, probably skeletons. To be on the ornery side, I'm going to say that they are skeletons wearing chainmail and armed with pole arms, pikes. That sounds good. Pole arms. So they do more damage and they have a better armor class. You can buff up undead monsters, zombies or skeletons, just by putting them in some armor. Choosing chainmail rather than plate mail because this is supposed to be an ancient tomb, so we're going to go with that. So that's the encounter for room 9. Because they were placed there as guardians, they are just standing there. If they are seen from room 5, they will be seen just standing there. They will not react until room 9 is entered, even if the characters are noisy or get into some kind of fight in the other rooms. Because that's not what they were placed there to do. They were placed there to guard the gates into rooms 10 and 11. And they will act to attack anyone who comes into the room. And they won't leave room 9. If the players retreat back into 5, or somehow if the players retreat into 5, the characters retreat into 5, they won't pursue them. If they retreat into 10 or 11, in other words, breaking down the gates or opening them somehow, the skeletons will follow them because either way around, they're supposed to be guarding those rooms. So they will guard those rooms. That also means if the player characters are in room 11 and open the gate into room 9, and the skeletons haven't been activated so far, unlikely but possible, the skeletons will immediately wake up and pursue them into room 11. Okay, so that has all of that taken care of. I probably should have numbered the partially flooded corridor between 7 and 11, but I'm going to leave that undone for this point. That leaves basically 4 and 5 to work with. Now let's see, I have placed monster with treasure, I've placed my unguarded treasure, I've placed my traps, one with the treasure, and my special. So basically it's just monsters. 4 or 5, either one is a logical place to put monster like spiders. Some kind of giant spider. And I'm leaning towards 5. The spider is laying in wait, so he or she or it is unlikely to pursue the characters anyplace else until after it's already attacked. So if they enter through room 4, they probably won't see the spider hiding in room 5. Or maybe they will, maybe they'll detect it. But the spider won't come into room 4 after them. I need to think about exactly how I want to describe this. I'm not thinking about this as a dungeon with particularly high ceilings. So I can't just say, well, the spider's up at the ceiling and you can't see it. Well, I mean, I could, but that would be stupid. So I'm not going to do that. But 5 seems like a logical place for a spider encounter. Not sure what I'm going to do with room 4. I will probably come back to that. Okay, so that's my plan as I've recorded it. I'm going to go over this room by room with you and discuss what I'm stocking here in the actual rooms, how I'm actually stocking them. I'll show the treasures, talk about how I made the decisions about them, and I will show the monsters that I'm actually placing, what specs I come out with for the skeletons in 9, for whatever goopy critters I put in 10, for the spiders in 5, and then for the 4 kings that are animated in room 12. I'm tempted to animate them all, but I'd like each one to be a different kind of corporeal undead, and I don't want to dig into the field guide undead. This is an ancient tomb. Field guide undead, many of them are kind of novel, and I want this to be fairly traditional. So that's what I'm going with. So let's move on into stocking these last rooms. Okay, folks, this video is running longer than I intended for it to. But let's see if we can get through this all. Kind of breeze through the rest of my development work. You just saw how I thought all this up. Now I'm going to write it all down. Room 4, spider lair. This is the description I'm going with at the moment. Part of the wall of this room is collapsed and water is pooled where the floor has subsided nearby, that the walls look decrepit as well. A rusted iron gate blocks off the far exit. The bars are rusted deeply and don't look very secure. Now I've decided that the bars can be broken open in this room with an ordinary roll to open a door, just a regular roll to break those bars because they are so badly pitted and deeply rusted. Of course, there is a giant crab spider in this room, one giant crab spider hanging up near the ceiling. It gets surprise on a 1 to 4 on a d6, and I've made a note that if it gains surprise, it can just remain hidden until a character comes nearby, and then take its surprise right at that point. Spider lair in room 5, very similar. The gate is rusted, but it's not as rusted. This room doesn't have water on the floor, so it's not as humid. So I'm going to allow the bars to be broken open with an open doors roll, but on a 1d10 instead of a 1d6, making it harder to do. And I've got 2 giant crab spiders in here, same arrangement as in room 4. Room 6, the false tomb. I haven't written the description yet. The treasure is under the sarcophagus. Characters having a total of 30 points of strength will have to work together to slide the sarcophagus out of the way. If they think to do this, they'll find a treasure, 500 silver pieces, some random jewels with a fairly decent value for some of them, and a bundle of 4 longbow arrows plus 1. So it's a pretty nice treasure. I'm still thinking a retainer of the first or second king maybe in this room, buried in the tomb, guardian or something like that. I'm not sticking a monster in here. I keep thinking about it, but I just don't think I want to. Room 7, I've labeled flooded room. And I've noted the presence of a treasure underneath the collapsed wall in a rusty iron box. The box is so rusty that it can't be opened properly or unlocked at all. But it can be broken open with a hit from a blunt weapon, or by being dropped more than 3 feet onto a hard floor. Shouldn't be hard to get into. 1,000 silver pieces, 1,000 copper pieces, 500 gold pieces. Room 8, the damaged trap. I've explained that one already. I pretty much just wrote down what I explained in the previous section. I've decided that there are 52, 5 rows alternating 10 and 11 holes, 52 total. Each time a thief tries and fails to disarm it, it will release 2d6 of those darts. I've got notes in here that characters in the line of fire must save. Anyone who fails to save takes 1d4 of the darts, each of which does 1d4 points of damage, until the darts are exhausted, or the characters are, one or the other. I've got that written down there. And each attempt to disarm the trap that fails will result in the release of more darts until the tubes are empty, basically. I haven't written a description for room 9, the guard room. I have dropped in stats for the skeletons. I'll put them on the screen. It's not like it's surprising or anything. They are in chainmail armor, which is making them tougher, and also they have pole arms, which makes them do more damage. You can't make skeletons too much of a challenge for 3rd level characters, which is what I'm targeting here, but I mean, you do what you can. Room 10, the room with the urns in it. Oh, I like this one. Here's the description. This large room is mostly empty. 2 10-foot square alcoves are set into the right-hand wall, with 2 identical alcoves on the left-hand wall. Each of the alcoves on the left contains a huge red urn, as does the further alcove on the right. The nearest alcove on the right is littered with the fragments of a shattered urn. Lying scattered on the floor near the broken urn are the bones of at least 2 human or humanoid creatures, judging by the number of skulls present. Now, the deal here is, some previous adventuring party actually came into this tomb, found their way to room 10, probably by turning the undead in room 9, which would have driven them back to the far wall without actually destroying them. And then the adventurers went on and opened the gate and got back into room 10. I'll need to make a note in room 9 when I go back up and fill in the details that the gate to room 10 is open. They broke one of the urns, not being able to figure out how to open it, which I'm going to discuss here in a minute, and released one of the creatures inside. So let's go over this. Each of those intact urns are sealed with lead. The lids are set down into the tops of the urns, which leaves a recess into which molten lead was poured. That makes removing the lids difficult, but not impossible. I'm leaving it up to the game master to adjudicate whatever attempts the players come up with to pry the lead out or whatever. Or they can just turn the urns over. Roll a total of 20 strength points, just kind of like the sarcophagus in room 6, is enough to tip one of them over, and if it's turned over, it'll shatter because it's so heavy. Now I got some descriptive lines. If a lid is successfully removed, the players will see the urn appears to be filled with a shiny black oil of some kind. If an urn is broken, shiny viscous black oil spreads in a wide pool around the broken urn. The far left-hand urn does in fact contain black oil. It's too thick to burn in a lamp, but it'll burn for 3d10 rounds, filling the room and rooms 4, 5, 9, and 11 with thick choking smoke if somebody thinks to light it. Probably not the smartest thing in the world to do. Underneath the oil, in that urn, is a smaller urn, which you can't see if you take the lid off, but which will be visible, obviously, and has a good chance of being broken if the urn is turned over. That urn is also sealed with lead, and inside of it is 700 silver pieces and 400 gold pieces. So it's an unguarded treasure, basically. The other two urns, which appear to contain black oil, contain black pudding. The black puddings were sealed inside a long time ago, which was hard on them. They became dormant, unable to find food or anything. They went into a dormant state, but they have still lost effectiveness. I've limited them. I put them down to just 5 hit dice instead of 10. I've also dropped their damage from 3d8 to 2d8. They're basically like the two that are in the room are like one black pudding that's been split, but I've lowered the damage. The third urn also had a black pudding in it. The adventurers turned it over, broke it, and a black pudding came out and killed a couple of them, and either killed them all or drove away the remainder. It doesn't really matter. They didn't come back and finish looting the dungeon. So these black puddings are listed with stats. I've broken them I'm going to show them on the screen. I've broken them up so that if they are split with weapons or lightning, splitting a 5 hit die black pudding makes a 3 and a 2. So I've divided the hit points up that way, and I don't have it in here yet, but I should put in a note about how to distribute damage using the check boxes, so I'll do that. The black puddings are still dormant. If you open the lid, they will lie dormant for 2d4 rounds before suddenly waking up and coming out to attack. If they're broken, they'll awaken in 1d4 rounds because they're exposed to more air. Now, I did it this way so that if the player characters either break open or pry open one of these jars and let out a black pudding, they'll get the idea that the oil will lay there for a little bit before it comes out and attacks them. So that if they open the treasure urn, as it were, and see the black oil in it, they're liable to run away out of fear of another black pudding coming after them. If they've opened one and then they open another, they are partly foolhardy already, but they may, try it just to see what they get. I'm really curious to see how this plays out. Room 11 I've described as having a mural. A mural covers all the walls of the room, and it depicts the building of the kingdom, shows kings in elaborate feathered crowns speaking to crowds of people, leading men into battle, and directing the construction of castles and other buildings. The section of the wall where the secret door is has a scene of men building a somber-looking temple. A large medallion on the temple's portico depicts wheat heads crossed. The sun is barely visible, peeking through dark clouds overhead. Now, the symbol of crossed wheat heads is one of the symbols of the god of death, Mor's Cane. That's from my campaign World of Glane. I'm listing this in the Game Master section so that any player who asks about it can be told that's what that symbol is for. The secret door is the trap, as I mentioned previously. If anyone searches for secret doors in this area, you roll twice. If the first roll is a success, the character finds the secret door and believes it's opened by pressing on the partially visible sun disk. If the first roll fails, but the second is a success, the searcher believes that pressing the medallion will open the door. But this, in fact, activates the trap, causing the entire room to be subjected to a magical ice storm, similar to the spell, but doing 1d6 points of damage per round for 1d6 plus 6 rounds. Each round, every creature in the room gets a saving throw versus spells to avoid damage, but if they fail, they take a d6 points of damage. Starting on the second round, ice on the floor makes the room movement rates half, and starting on the fourth round, every character who attempts to move must save versus death ray, with a dex bonus added, or fall down instead of moving, requiring a full round to stand up again. Creatures resistant to cold take no damage, but still have to suffer the movement effects. So if anybody has a ring of cold resistance or whatever, they'll still have to be affected by that. For this room, I do need to note that the trap can be triggered multiple times and how often I'll allow it to be triggered. I haven't actually decided that yet. I'll figure something out before I put it down. It shouldn't just go off every time you poke the button, but it should recharge itself on some kind of a basis. It may be daily, it may be hourly, I don't know. I'll think about it. Room 12. I haven't written the descriptive text yet, but this is the burial chamber for the kings of Adrih. I've lettered them A through E on the map, so I'll show the map right now so you can see the arrangement of the room. 12A is the sarcophagus of King Farron. King Farron is dead. He's just lying there. The sarcophagus is simple. It has a crudely engraved crown on the lid placed under his name. And there's no treasure in the sarcophagus. The body's not animated. It's just a sarcophagus with a guy buried in it. That was the first king. The second king, King Nem, had a little bit nicer sarcophagus. Still plain, but has a crown and a scepter, both horizontal, underneath his name, with a cartouche around it. The remainder of the lid is a knotwork border, and there's a pattern of knotwork flowers. Within the sarcophagus lays the remains of King Nem, who is an animated skeleton. He wears around his neck a gold necklace with opals and an onyx in it, worth 3,000 gold pieces. So in other words, the treasure is on the monster. You've got to kill the monster to get the treasure. But he's just an ordinary animated skeleton, so he shouldn't be too hard to kill. 12C is the sarcophagus of King Verhas. It has knotwork patterns on the lid and on the sides, very similar to King Nem's sarcophagus. In the center of the lid is carved the name of King Verhas, below which is a crown and a scepter, just as with Nem's sarcophagus. Verhas is a zombie. He's wearing a full-suited chainmail +1, which makes him fairly tough to kill, and that is the treasure associated with Verhas that the player characters will have to fight for. 12D is a pale marble sarcophagus carved around the sides with vines with prominent thorns. Lids carved with the frame of similar pattern. Blank space in the center has the name of King Nem II, and the crown carved above his name, a scepter carved beneath it. King Nem II is a white. Now, he's the only one that will wake up before his sarcophagus is opened. If he feels the life force of someone standing near the sarcophagus, he'll wake up and start pounding on the lid. He can't open it, but he'll make his presence known, hammering or scratching, trying to get out, which should be pretty creepy. He has some interesting stuff on him. He's wearing a heavy gold torque, worth 1,500 gold pieces, and a heavy gold thumb ring with an onyx in it, worth 1,000 gold pieces. Hidden in a compartment at the bottom of a sarcophagus, which is discovered as a secret door if anyone searches for it, is a cursed ring of fire vulnerability. Anybody who puts it on is stuck with it, yet causes them to fail every saving throw against any kind of fire attack. Ring can only be removed with a remove curse spell. If the ring is subjected to a remove curse spell while it's not being worn by anyone, in other words, a second spell if somebody's already put it on, the curse on the ring can be removed, turning it into a ring of fire resistance. If anybody figures this out, they're going to come out with a pretty nice treasure, because you can't hardly beat a ring of fire resistance for a nice protective item. Of course, it is a white, which does energy drain damage, so King Nem II is a good challenge, but he's not as big a challenge as King Miker. His sarcophagus, 12E, is pale marble, carved around the sides with a repeating pattern of ankhs. The lid is also pale marble, engraved with a pattern of stylized water birds, cranes, or egrets around the outside. At the center of the lid is the name of King Miker, with a crown carved above the name and a scepter below it. The central engravings are decorated with gold leaf, worth about a silver piece to anyone who bothers to spend a whole turn scraping it out of the carving. King Miker is a mummy. His body was prepared with blessed and enchanted natron from distant Sin, ancient country in my own campaign, World of Glane, which is also the source of the Ankh symbols engraved on the sarcophagus. In other words, they got a master embalmer from Sin to do it instead of having him embalmed by the local guys. So Miker got a very special treatment, and that very special treatment has turned him into a mummy. The mummy, King Miker, wears a heavy wide gold and silver necklace, the kind that you see on Egyptian statues and in pictures. A heavy gold and silver necklace adorned with onyx and opal beads, and a large central scarab made of jade. The necklace is worth at least 10,000 gold pieces, but it's fragile and will be damaged if exposed to fire. I've got a range of reduction of damage of 20 to 8, reduction of value from damage by fire of 20 to 80%, 2d4 times 10. So anybody who uses the obvious method of attacking a mummy, setting him on fire, will be potentially dramatically reducing the value of the treasure they'll get from his body. There is also a hidden compartment in his sarcophagus, also found as a secret door. 1200 SP, 2000 GP, a potion of undead control, wouldn't that be handy? A ring of animal control, and a wand of trap detection. So there's a lot of nice stuff in there, if they can get it out. So this last room. It's a pretty good treasure trove, but it's also a good challenge. Some of the monsters won't be hard to kill. Some of the monsters might be quite hard to kill, and the treasures won't be easy to find. The player characters will have to be on their game to really get a benefit out of this room. So that's it. That concludes the dungeon design. I will come back and polish this, add in missing descriptive text, put in the items that I mentioned that I haven't filled in yet. I note about the open gate between 9 and 10. Notes about some other things that I've mentioned. I'll go back over this recording actually to make sure I haven't missed anything. But once I get that done, basically the adventure is done. It could be ready to print in another day or two of polishing and honing. Although, of course, I would prefer to finish my playtest first. I'm looking forward to it. This is happening on Thursday, February 25th. We played our first playtest session last night using the text that I basically just described to you. Just go take a watch of that video because it should already be posted at this point if you want to see what happened. And in fact, the whole actual play should all be out there already for you guys to watch. So hopefully it all came out right. This is a weird situation since I'm recording this before I'm done with the playtest, but I want to record it while the decisions are so clear in my mind. So I guess that's the video. Thanks for listening. Have a nice day.